Hello, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Ursula. I'm an indie author of historical fiction, and I've also been an avid reader since the age of 3. For Spooktober today, I'm wearing a dark blue lipstick, which I've never worn before, from NYX. I don't really wear makeup very much at all because I'm so tomboyish, but I do enjoy playing around with fun colors, particularly during the Halloween season. Now, today I'm going to be talking about my feelings about a lot of currently published in the U.S. Young adult novels that purport to be historical fiction. I've written about this number of times before this on my blog. I'm very aware this might be a unpopular opinion, but I frankly don't, care what other people think of me. These are like my opinions I've formed over a lot of, years and careful thought about the situation and just looking at a lot of books. So let's get on with it. So well, this isn't recent anymore, but this is a blog post I wrote in 2013, and I was mentioning I had recently read a Goodreads review of Gillian Larkin's Diva, which is a book in her Flappers trilogy, which I thought really nailed the problems I've seen with a lot of current historical YA, or at least published in the U.S., as I'll explain later. Foreign YA historical does tend to be better, in my opinion. These characters in the book Diva are in their late teens in the 1920s, and their behavior is supposed to be so shocking for teens, like going to speakeasies and premarital cohabiting. But that was kind of normal adult behavior for that set and that era. Not to mention, premarital cohabiting was a scandal for anyone outside of a very few bohemian places like Greenwich Village and probably places in San Francisco. In your late teens, you were an adult in the 1920s. It's like the writer couldn't make up her mind as to whether to write a teen or adult story, and so tries to play both sides. And as I've mentioned, you can't really do that. You have to choose definitively which age market you're writing for, either adult or teens. And of course, there are many adult books that just happen to have child or teen characters, but they're not written for that age. And there are some, well, I guess it's not very common anymore, YA books that happen to have older characters, and but they're written in a specific voice and style for that age marketing category. And for much of the 20th century and for all of human history before that, young people assumed mature adult roles and responsibilities early on. People didn't assume you came from a broken home if you married in your late teens in, say, 1880 or 1910. But although, by the way, the average age at first marriage historically in most eras and settings, there were some notable exceptions, was rough for women, roughly about 18 to maybe 26, 27. Sometimes it would skew higher, sometimes skew lower, but it was generally within that age bracket. And it was really not as common as a lot of people believe it was for women were marrying and as soon as they got out of high school, or sometimes even before that. That just it generally wasn't the norm, but it wasn't super uncommon. It just wasn't what people did generally. For example, if you married in when you were that age, they wouldn't assume you were stupid or just marrying your boyfriend to get away from an abusive home situation. You were just a mature adult wanting your own family and assuming more mature responsibilities as you stepped into a new phase of your life. And a lot of couples getting engaged and married in the post-World War II era in particular were in their late teens and very early 20s. Some of them were even as young as 15, I've read, and they began having children very quickly, although obviously we know that did happen in large part because there was no legal or effective birth control for most people. So, they basically had to get married if they wanted to, live together and have sex with society's permission. And obviously, if you got pregnant out of wedlock, that was a huge scandal, and terrible things would generally happen if you didn't quickly marry the father. And, marrying young, as I've been mentioning, that was considered normal since they were considered adults. So if you're portraying a teen doing this is so shocking in the past, that's, completely historically inaccurate. A lot of the U.S. published historical YA I've found from recent years seems to want it both ways. You can't portray a teen of the 1940s, 1920s, or 1930s like a teen of today. They would be more like a miniature adult, albeit with somewhat of a youthful outlook. It's just laughable to read, for example, anti-smoking sentiments in YA historical. If anything, the average teen of the past would have smoked or been excited for the day when he or she were old enough to smoke. Well, I do have some teen characters who don't smoke, but that's based on finding it a lowbrow habit, immoral, not common in their native culture, etc. And those views wouldn't have been widespread, and they certainly wouldn't have gone around lecturing other teens on not smoking. That's just freaking ridiculous. And a lot of the YA historical I've run across recently seemed to be YA, for example, like, teen-centered first, and historical second. Like they're teens who just happen to be living in the past, not like an intense, richly detailed historical story that just happens to feature teens in the leading roles. And I was when I was taking a YA lit class when I was doing master's degree work for library science, I was really excited to read two of the books for my final project in that class. Paul Dowswell's The Auslander and Anne C. Verhoeven's My Family for the War. Those are wonderful books, by the way. I highly recommend both of them. The Auslander was originally published in England, and My Family for the War was originally published in Germany. Its native language title is Liverpool Street. They have so many wonderful historical details, and they take time to build characters and settings. They're not just like period pieces with teen characters or like fluffy Gossip Girl and period clothes nonsense, which I really dislike that trend too. I should do another vlog all about that subject. And My Family for the War ages the character Franziska, who later assumes the name Frances after she comes to England on the Kindertransport from age 10 to age 17. And there's a short epilogue in her early 20s, which is like almost unheard of in YA these days. A real, true Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age story like Anne of Green Gables or A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, where, she ages completely like out of teenagerhood by the end, or doesn't even start as a teen. She's, maybe a child, or sometimes he, but generally coming of age in YA these days tends to be, female centric. There aren't as many like male main characters as there are female main characters, and it's more about the journey from child to young adult. It's not, plot centric, bang, bang, bang. It's all about this one specific issue instead of like a rich, slower paced character built, story where the story is like the coming of age, the journey through life and learning lessons along the way and coming through history, not like we have to like, solve this specific problem and that's like literally all the entire book is about and nothing else is important, even if it might help to, bring out the historical setting or the character development. I've never had any problem with characters in a book aging dramatically. And if a book is set during a long-running historical event, like World War II, the U.S. Civil War, the 1960s, I kind of expect to follow that character through all of it, not just like the first year or the last 6 months. Like, otherwise, like, why are you writing historical during such an intense time if you don't intend to follow that, major era throughout? That just kind of feels like cheating, or you didn't take us all the way, or, you lost interest. So, obviously you need to have interest in, I'm sorry, I'm rambling, in that historical era, and not just, oh, I'm choosing this because it's cool, but I don't really care about it. I'm just writing like about a few months with like a plot-centric story and not history-centric. And, I don't want to stereotype or generalize, but I feel that since like the YA explosion, like probably I would guess maybe like 20 years ago by now, like YA has come to mean something a lot different than what it was in my generation. I was born in 1979. I graduated high school in 98. Before it had that designation that it does today, it was not, I don't even think they really called it YA so much. In my era, it was just, like books for teens, or maybe they called it young adult. I don't really remember anyone using that specific term YA. I mean, I even remember the term JA, junior adult, which they would call middle grade now, and I don't even recall the term middle grade at all. They were just, books about, specific ages and like put in certain like parts of the library. You can't really have a teen with a self-centric young voice if he or she lives, 50 plus years ago. I mean, if you've read the book or seen the film, just think of how Scarlett and Mellie are 16 at the start of Gone with the Wind, but they're never portrayed as anything but adult women with adult speech, motivations, and action. If you've also read the excellent book by Kathleen Winsor, Forever Amber, which is set during the Restoration era in England in the late 17th century. It's often compared to like Gone with the Wind for many, many reasons. There's lots of parallels between Amber and Scarlett. Amber also starts out at the age of 16 and ages quite dramatically throughout the book. And, they might not be like on the same level as they are at the end when they're like fully adult, like women in their 20s with children and like, all these much more mature life experiences, but they're still considered adults in their era in society. It's not like, oh, you're teenagers, no, we must treat you a little bit differently. No, they were, just smaller, your younger versions of like actual adults, and not treated like they didn't know anything or couldn't share in these certain kinds of experiences. I do consider myself a writer first, a historical writer second, and a teen or a children's writer third. Like it or not, I really don't think my Showa books would be considered YA in today's market, although I did classify the first one I published and Jakob Flew the Fiend Away as YA, mostly for like metadata indexing purposes, and because Jakob does age from 14 to 20, and I did like deliberately like write it more towards like a YA sensibility. So I do think that still stands, but in my heart, technically, I do consider it just more of a like an intense historical that just happens to feature a teen boy in the main role. The themes, language, and situations and roles are just too unteen-like by contemporary measurements, not to mention the lengths. I don't really do like modern like word count policing. Oh no, you wrote over 100K. That's so terrible. You must start slashing characters and pages right now so it can be a more acceptable 65K. Maybe after you've proven yourself for 10 years, then we'll let you do something that's, like 500 pages. But you have to like write little 300-page books in the meantime because no one wants to read sagas anymore. Give me a freaking break. Many people who love, real like serious literature and intense historicals, like they like really long books, and they're like surprised that like many like mainstream agents and editors don't think that's, acceptable or popular anymore. People just need to listen to what actual readers and lovers of historical like, not what, they think, oh, what's popular or trendy now is shorter books, because they think no one has a long attention span anymore, that like everyone is a reluctant reader. But that's a whole rant for another subject. And I'm also used to historicals being long, like for example, Leon Uris, Herman Wouk, James Michener, all sorts of writers like that. When a book covers like a long span of time with a large ensemble cast, you kind of have to be long to like tell the story fully, because like you can't really have a good story that sets over, let's say like 15 years, like 20 or so like important characters, secondary as well as main characters, and have it, told properly the way it needs to be told. If you're like rushing it through in like all of 288 pages, that's completely freaking ridiculous. And because I am used to historicals being long, I generally don't see an issue with the historical about a teen set over many years being at least 120,000 words, which is basically considered like the bare minimum of length for a good historical, unless of course it's set over like maybe like 3 months or something, or perhaps like a full year. That generally then that would make sense for it to be shorter, because it's not like an intense like journey through like coming of age or like a big historical event. Sometimes quieter and like smaller or shorter does work for historical, obviously, but it does vary case by case. Now obviously I do most lean most strongly towards the like longer ones set over longer periods. And like honestly, if you think a book that's like only like 400 pages or so is way too long, you don't realize that's a drop in the bucket next to some of like these other historical novels. Like just go into like a library or like a bookstore and look at the classic historical books, even not even necessarily super old from 100 plus years ago, but even from like the 60s and 70s, maybe even to the 80s and 90s. Long is what historical is supposed to be. And I understand there are different sensibilities and word count considerations if like it's a younger audience, but it can still be fairly long, like 400 pages or so, or maybe even like 600 necessarily. It depends on the story and what it's about, and the age range reading it, like for example older teens versus younger teens. But you shouldn't insult teenagers' intelligence by believing they're all reluctant readers and have short attention spans and can't bear to handle anything much over 300 pages. Just talk to them and listen to them, and try to understand what they like to read and what they might want to write themselves, and don't just like assume, oh, everyone wants like really short, like simplistic, like shallow, fluffy Gossip Girl and period close books. And it was a long, slow, challenging process for me to realize I usually write adult fiction that just happens to focus on young characters, because the perception of the young adult category has changed so much from the time I myself was a young adult. And as I've mentioned, I really didn't read too many teen books when I was a teenager myself. I graduated to adult lit almost full time when I was 14 years old and discovered Hermann Hesse. It was basically no looking back after that. It was time to read like the big guns intended for adults, because I was getting more mature in what I was able to read. And I've always read several grade levels above myself, and with some notable exceptions, I haven't liked a lot of the YA historicals published in the U.S. within probably, now it would be like more than 10 years, maybe or as much as like 15, 20 or so, since the huge like YA explosion. And as I've mentioned, like the best YA historicals I've found in recent years have tended to be published like outside of the US, where, you know, historical generally tends to be more like serious and intense instead of, oh, just like a fluffy Gossip Girl and period clothes story. And like it's more about being a teen than, you know, living through like an intense historical time. And many times, one of my blogging buddies or the reading public at large raves about a certain YA historical, and I have the exact opposite reaction when I check it out. And I often wonder if you even read the same book. You know, probably a big reason I prefer YA historicals published outside of the US is because those books focus more on the history instead of the teen experience, and they also have a voice and style that speaks to people of all ages instead of feeling intended only for teens. And well, I actually do really like a lot of middle grade historicals I've read over the last 10 years or so, and a select few YA historicals published in the US, because obviously it's wrong to generalize. There are some wonderful exceptions. I just feel like the current YA style doesn't fit very well with traditional historical storytelling. I want to read about young people living through history, not young people who just happen to live in the past, which, you know, obviously why are you even writing historical if you don't care like when they're living and like imbuing with all these wonderfully rich period details. Just like write a contemporary and go if that's where your heart seems to be. The extreme oversaturation of first person YA is also a roadblock for me. You know, first person absolutely can be done phenomenally well, but historical is a genre which traditionally works best with third person omniscient for a reason, or maybe like third person limited if it's more like the story of one or maybe two characters. With so many YAs being like first person these days, narrators start to run together after a while. And obviously, you know, as I mentioned before, a lot of them are trying, they sound like all the same, and they're all trying to adopt this like snarky Holden Caulfield-esque style, and it's kind of like, you know, obnoxious and annoying, and it doesn't really work the way they think it does. It just makes them sound all like cookie cutters. And first person voice kind of seems like too modern in person for historical, again with like some exceptions. I am, as I've mentioned, writing my current work in progress alternative historical about Dante and Beatrice, and first person from Dante's point of view, and that was like a giant surprise to me that I would actually, you know, not only want to do like first person when I almost never do that except for like a short interlude like a letter or like a journal entry or something, but as one of the greatest writers in history actually writing in his voice. But that felt perfect for the project, and like third person would have felt, you know, too distant, and it wasn't the right voice for that project. So, you know, it can work obviously sometimes, but you can't just choose it as like a thoughtless, meaningless default because, oh, that's what everyone is doing, or I've never seen anything else, so I guess I've got to do it that way too. And as I mentioned, there was no concept of adolescence until really the 20th century. They didn't even have like the word teenager. I mean, there were children and then there were adults. And yes, some adults were younger and less experienced, but they were still considered adults in the eyes of society. For example, many of the young wives in the Decameron are all of 13 or 14. And while it was, you know, less common for like girls to marry at that age, like in that era, it was, you know, somewhat more common in medieval and Renaissance Italy for girls to marry when they were teenagers. So that is, you know, historically accurate, even though like in the wider world of Europe it generally wasn't as frequent for like women or girls to be marrying when they were only, you know, like 13, 14, 15. It's kind of hard to forcibly bend the story of a teenager 100 plus years ago to have the same voice, experiences, and sensibilities as a teen of the modern era. Choosing famous young adult as the protagonist also fails for me. Again, obviously, if you're gearing this like as YA, not as an adult novel, just happens to feature a young person, like someone like Joan of Arc or Catherine Howard, one of Henry VIII's wives, would have been seen as an adult by her society and era. And in a side note, the cover of Catherine Longshore's Guilt, the first in a series about the Tudor court, uncannily resembles the cover of Madonna's Erotica. If you don't believe me, check it out. It's really weird and funny. Many historical writers do give characters somewhat more modern views and behavior than most people of that era had, which does kind of make sense because it can make them feel, you know, more relevant and relatable to modern audiences. But however, I've seen a lot of recent YA historicals that make characters way too modern, not just to like try to make them seem, you know, more believable or sympathetic, instead of like, for example, someone who feels, oh, girls are unequal to boys, and therefore I shouldn't want an education. I should just, marry as soon as I can and like have children throughout my life and never do anything else. Like, who can relate to that? And by the way, that also, there was a lot of nuance in the past. Most women wouldn't have like thought like, stereotypes and like been completely unempowered. They were just empowered in, different ways. And there were ways for like women to be progressive, for example, and like they will use like anachronistic slang, or high society debutantes having premarital sex with a stable boy, lecturing people about smoking, like shacking up with a boyfriend of another race. Obviously that I obviously of course like support interracial marriage and interdating, but like in the past, like that was illegal, and that wouldn't have been just something someone did at the drop of a hat. There had to be like some like really compelling reason why they would like this person enough to want to break the law to do this. You can't just like sprinkle it in as like, oh, look how progressive and modern this person is. Like, there's lots of repercussions you have to think through for a lot of things you're doing, because you're trying to make these characters seem modern. And that leads up to the Gossip Girl and period clothes style, like as I mentioned earlier, Gillian Larkin's Flapper series and Anna Godberson's Lux and Bright Young Things series. The Lux is set, it begins in 1899, and Bright Young Things is like a Flappers book in the late 1920s. Any actual history is shallow window dressing for stories that essentially read like contemporaries. And these books also fail because, as I mentioned, they're trying to play it both ways. Either you're writing about teenagers having authentic teenage experiences, or you're writing about younger adults having pretty normal experiences for their era. And then we have laughably unrealistic nonsense like Judy Blundell's What I Saw and How I Lied, which I read for one of the books in my YA lit class. I gave it a scathing review in the report I had to read about it. I don't think the teacher wasn't very impressed. She didn't really like warm to most of the reports I wrote, because I genuinely didn't like most of these books I read for the class. I just didn't connect with them. I found like the style like stupid, like, and obnoxious. I didn't relate to the narrators. I thought the stories were like unbelievable and like freaking ridiculous. I can mention that in another vlog. And anyway, in the What I Saw and What I Lied, 15-year-old Evie sees nothing of risking her reputation by heavily making out with two legal adult men, which also creeped me out. And it's like she's not scared of getting caught or things going too far and getting sent off to a Florence Crittenden home for unwed mothers. Like, any of these people, like, particularly if they're under a certain age, they just genuinely don't seem to realize how different the past was, because, they take for granted always having, a permissive attitude. Oh, that's totally fine if you're not like, sleeping with someone you don't intend to marry, having children without ever marrying that person, like, just casually dating for 5-10 years. They just don't understand. You just didn't do that in the past. And it wasn't necessarily, I don't think, because people like had a certain morality that said I shouldn't be like, having sex outside of marriage. It was just, there were so many like frightening repercussions and scandals if you were caught or the wrong person found out about it. And so a lot of people just genuinely seem ignorant of what like society was like, even as recently as like, 40, 50 years ago. And just the bottom line, I'm sick and tired of historicals featuring typical YA contemporary characters who just happen to be plunked into the past. And I'm also tired of books with very adult situations being passed off as YA just because the characters are teenagers. And so hopefully I haven't been too rambly this time and trying to stay more on topic. I hopefully will have another vlog coming up on Wednesday. I'm not sure of the topic yet, but if you have watched through to the end of this vlog, thank you very much for listening to my thoughts, and hopefully I will see you guys again very soon. Thanks. Bye.